A man sits alone in a cold bank lobby, his calm face masking a lifetime of battles fought and won in silence. Around him, whispered doubts and sideways glances build a wall designed to keep him invisible, to question his worth without ever speaking a word. He's here with a simple purpose, requesting a business loan. But the real story is hidden beneath the surface, where power, prejudice, and history collide. No one knows who he truly is, or the influence he wields, until everything shatters in an unexpected revelation that turns the tables on those who doubted him. This is a story about more than money. It's about respect, justice, and the courage to demand both. If this intrigues you, like the video, subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think will happen next. Your voice helps bring these stories to life. Solomon Avery stepped through the heavy glass doors of Patriot National Bank and paused a moment to let his eyes adjust. The lobby was a cool cavern of quiet, polished granite floors and the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting overhead. He took a measured breath, feeling the subtle ache in his ribs where time had begun to stiffen him. He wore his old ash-gray linen suit, its threads slightly thinned at the elbows but crisply pressed. His brown leather shoes were scuffed around the sides from years of use, but they shone with polish applied by his own hand that morning, reflecting his belief in the dignity of small things done right. In his right hand, the dark walnut cane bore the marks of age, with deep Navajo-style carvings of spirals and zigzags, telling a quiet story of craftsmanship and patience. It wasn't a simple walking stick, it was a part of his history, his silent witness to decades of resilience. On his left ring finger sat a silver band, dull with age and scratched from hard work, engraved with a weathered compass design that caught the light like an old promise not yet forgotten. Solomon moved carefully forward, the cane tapping the floor with each step in a steady rhythm. He had come here for a purpose, a plan he'd worked on late into many nights, a loan application to expand the little grocery store he'd built with his hands over 4 decades. It was time to modernize, to leave something stronger for his son to take over. He believed in the plan, just as he believed in rising early and treating others with respect. But the bank did not seem to notice his intentions. At the far end of the room, 2 tellers sat behind a curved counter. One scrolled slowly through her phone, barely glancing up, while the other adjusted the angle of her makeup mirror in the screen of her idle computer. Neither greeted him. They pretended not to see the old man in the suit with the carved cane. He paused in front of the counter. He would not clear his throat to get attention. His father had taught him that waiting with patience was its own kind of strength. Still, the seconds dragged. Royce Calhoun, the branch manager, could be seen through the glass of his office, pacing while talking into his headset with large, showy gestures, as if performing for an unseen audience. Solomon watched him pause to laugh at something, his mouth pulling wide in a salesman's grin before his eyes swept the lobby and passed right over Solomon without stopping. Royce turned away, the headset pressed to his mouth, vanishing deeper into the back hallway without a word. Solomon let out a slow breath, careful not to let the tremor in his hip cause him to sway. He adjusted his grip on the cane. He wore the suit not to impress, but to show respect for the moment. But the gesture seemed invisible here. He watched as the 2 tellers exchanged a private comment, one giving a small smirk while the other ducked her head to hide a laugh. They still did not address him. Solomon turned slightly to face the reception counter. He placed his loan application down, aligning the edges neatly. The paper was worn at the corner, where he had clutched it on the ride over. It contained his plan in detail, cost projections, supplier contacts, a marketing outline that his granddaughter had helped him type. The plan was solid. It was honest. And it now sat at the very edge of the counter, where one of the tellers nonchalantly brushed it aside, half covering it with utility payment slips, as though it were no more important than junk mail. Solomon's steel-gray eyes tracked the movement, narrowing only slightly. He didn't protest. Instead, he tightened his grip on the cane, knuckles widening. The cane felt heavier than usual. His chest felt tight, but he held himself upright. The buzz of the bank's fluorescent lights seemed to get louder, filling the silence left by the absence of even the most basic greeting. He could feel the stares of other customers behind him, a man with a briefcase glancing, then quickly looking away, a young woman pretending to check her watch to avoid the uncomfortable scene. They all saw it, but no one said a word. The hush was not peaceful but sterile, weighted with the knowledge that he did not belong in its new, polished version of success. A sign reading "Now Serving" blinked softly above the reception desk in neon blue. The digits displayed 000 as though waiting for him. But when he reached toward the number dispenser mounted at waist height, the light above the machine flickered twice, then died with a soft electric pop. The small plastic tickets inside sat dark and unspooling, mocking his hand as it hovered for a second too long. He frowned but didn't curse. Solomon pressed his lips together and glanced at the two reception clerks. Neither moved to help. The taller one watched the screen in front of her, as if the numbers dancing there were more real than he was, while the other ran her fingers through her sleek hair, her eyes glazed with boredom. For a moment, he considered tapping the cane gently on the tile to get their attention, but decided against it. He would not beg them to see him. Instead, he cleared his throat once, quietly. Nothing. He exhaled slowly and shifted his weight again. The ache in his hip seemed to bloom, spreading heat through the muscle, making him tighten his grip around the carved cane. The light caught on the intricate Navajo-style symbols. The little grooves darkened with years of oil from his palm. He steadied himself and watched the lobby with the quiet focus of a man who had spent decades in business, reading people, understanding the undercurrents no one spoke aloud. It was clear he was unwelcome. The entire space was designed for people who did not look like him, did not dress like him, and certainly did not need to request favors. The words on the posters behind the tellers, community, trust, loyalty, looked like lies in neon colors. Finally, one of the clerks glanced at him. Her eyes flickered up and down, judging the cheapness of his old suit, the wear in his shoes, the dark line of his carved cane. With a flat expression, she turned and rummaged behind the counter before sliding a small stack of forms toward the edge. They didn't bother checking if he could even reach from where he stood. Solomon shifted carefully, moved his cane, and stepped forward. The forms fluttered as he picked them up. He glanced at the header and felt something tighten in his chest. They were old. The logo at the top was a design the bank hadn't used in years, and worse, the formatting was incomplete. The Section 4 business type had no accompanying field for details. The space for collateral was split oddly across two lines. He sighed once through his nose, the breath hissing softly as he lowered his eyes. But he wouldn't let them see the frustration. Instead, he let his cane balance him as he drew a pen from his inner jacket pocket, clicking it with slow precision. He began filling out the outdated form. The pen scratched softly, and for a moment he forgot everything except the need to keep his handwriting neat and firm. Each stroke felt like an act of defiance. But when he was halfway through, he heard a sharp laugh behind the counter, and the clerk nudged her colleague, whispering something. They watched him for a moment too long before turning away, shoulders shaking. He didn't look up. He simply clenched his jaw and kept writing. A minute later, she returned without a word, slammed down a fresh set of forms next to the old ones, and walked away. The new forms were the correct ones, newer branding, clearer fields. No apology, no explanation. Solomon let his eyes rest on them for a moment, then very slowly folded the half-complete, outdated form, slid it into his jacket, and picked up the new stack. His fingers trembled a little, betraying the rage he refused to show. He began again, carefully, standing there in the middle of the bank floor with his cane leaning against the counter. The chair at the reception desk was intentionally turned away, making it impossible for him to sit and write. He had to balance his weight on his weaker hip. His hip burned with every small movement, the pain like a hot wire twisting through old scar tissue. He had filled in every box meticulously, listing his suppliers, costs, expected profits, and his plan to expand the store that had fed his family and half the neighborhood over the decades. He had signed his name with deliberate strokes, letters crisp despite the tremor in his fingers that age had given him. Now he waited in silence. The clerks behind the counter refused to meet his eyes. One scrolled on her phone while the other adjusted the collar of her blazer, as if to create an invisible barrier between herself and the man standing patiently in front of them. Solomon cleared his throat once, not to beg, but to remind them he was there. The sound was swallowed by the sterile hush of the lobby. A clock ticked over the door, each second a tiny hammer driving in the realization that he was being ignored on purpose. The line behind him shifted and murmured, but no one stepped forward to help. A small group of waiting customers formed a loose semicircle in the lobby center, watching with feigned disinterest as the scene unfolded. Solomon glanced at the wide expanse of the lobby floor, all polished granite that caught every overhead light like water. Scattered throughout were plush chairs and small, sleek end tables stacked with glossy bank brochures. They were empty, designed to look inviting, but none of the staff suggested he use them. His hips screamed for relief, but Solomon stayed where he was, his grip on the cane white-knuckled, refusing to let them see him falter. He would not ask to sit. His father had taught him that some things were never asked for, only earned. But the ache deepened, threatening to buckle his old but still stubborn knees. Then the door to the manager's glass office opened with a hiss, and Royce Calhoun emerged. His hair was a precise line of sandy blonde, and his suit was that overly crisp shade of navy blue that telegraphed new money trying too hard. He held a manila folder in one hand, gesturing widely with the other as he spoke to someone behind him on a headset. His voice was a practiced blend of forced cheer and smugness that cut through the room's hush. Royce's gaze flicked to the waiting customers and then paused, resting on Solomon just long enough to make it clear he saw him, but chose not to acknowledge him. Instead, Royce turned sharply, fixing his eyes on a new arrival entering through the bank's double doors. The newcomer was young, white, athletic in build, dressed in a light gray tailored suit that caught the lobby lights like polished silver. He carried a thin black briefcase and walked with the brisk, oblivious confidence of someone who'd been assured since birth that the world was ready to step aside for him. Solomon watched as Royce's eyes lit up. The manager turned, his voice rising with easy charm, greeting the young man loudly enough that the entire lobby could hear the welcome in every warm syllable. Royce strode forward and extended his hand, pumping the client's arm with a familiarity that felt like family, even though it was business. The young man smiled, teeth white and straight, and Royce clapped him on the back, steering him through the middle of the lobby without a single glance back at the older man waiting silently, forms in hand. They passed so close Solomon had to lean back on his cane to give them room, feeling the tight pull in his hip as he did so. Royce didn't apologize for nearly brushing him aside. He didn't slow. Instead, he guided the young client directly to the private office Solomon had seen earlier. The glass walls were clear, and the luxurious leather chairs inside gleamed under recessed lighting. Royce pushed the door open with a flourish, motioning his preferred customer inside with an exaggerated bow, as if welcoming royalty. The door swung shut with a soft click that sounded, to Solomon, like a lock turning on opportunity itself. Solomon stood alone again in the center of the lobby, an island in a sea of expensive marketing slogans and silent witnesses. He felt the weight of eyes on him, some curious, some pitying, most simply uncomfortable with the truth they saw, and would pretend to forget as soon as they walked out the door. He inhaled slowly, letting the stale bank air fill his lungs, willing the anger that swelled in his chest to cool before it reached his eyes. The posters on the wall read community and service in bold, inspiring fonts. He read them as accusations. His grip tightened on the form in his left hand until the paper bent slightly. He made himself ease it before it tore. The silver ring on his finger pressed into his skin, the old compass engraving biting lightly, reminding him of the directions he had once believed in. But now he felt himself drift a little unmoored, as if no direction here would lead to dignity. The room felt colder. He looked at the reception clerks again. His gaze rested on the reflections cast by the polished floor, the two bright lights above blurring the edges of everything, making the lobby look like some antiseptic fishbowl. The sounds around him were muffled but unmistakable. The quiet shuffling of forms, the beep of scanners, the low hum of corporate background music that claimed to soothe but only made the silence feel weaponized. He straightened his back as much as the old ache in his hip would allow. The forms in his hand were creased now from how tightly he had been holding them while Royce walked the other client into the private office. Solomon had smoothed them 3 times already with his palm, careful not to let the ink smudge. He shifted on his cane, tapping it gently against the floor in a small, unconscious rhythm that measured the passing time in tiny defeats. No one offered him help. No one even met his eyes. He could feel them though, the sidelong glances from the other customers waiting behind him in the unspoken queue that seemed to form by default, careful to give him space without offering solidarity. They didn't want to be too close, didn't want to be implicated in whatever he was. Solomon didn't need to look at them to know what those glances held. He had seen them all his life. He breathed in slowly, reminding himself that anger wouldn't help here, that patience was the only armor he had left. Then finally, as if reluctantly remembering they had a job to do, one of the clerks glanced up. She had long, flat-ironed hair that shone like plastic under the lights, and a name tag pinned at a perfect angle to her lapel. She met his eyes only for a second, then flicked her gaze down to the forms in his hand. With a pointed slowness, she extended her own hand. Solomon moved forward, the cane scraping softly against the floor, and held out his papers. He tried to keep his expression neutral, tried to keep the tremor from his fingers from making him seem frail. The clerk watched the forms approach like they were something unpleasant she'd have to touch. Then, with dramatic care, she reached to her left and took a thin pair of disposable gloves from a clear plastic box. She pulled them on one finger at a time, snapping the elastic at her wrist for emphasis, the sound sharp and surgical in the hush. Solomon felt something hollow out in his chest. He swallowed, the movement slow, forced, and he held the papers a fraction tighter to keep from letting his hand shake in anger or humiliation. She didn't rush. She finished adjusting the gloves, checking the fit, smoothing them down. Only then did she reach forward and pluck the forms from his fingers with a kind of practiced delicacy, as though they might stain her even through the plastic. She turned her back on him immediately, talking quietly to her colleague in a voice pitched just low enough to keep the words inaudible, but the contempt clear. Solomon's eyes fell to his empty hands. He lowered them slowly to the knob of his cane. He pressed down just enough to remind himself he could still stand. He could still hold himself up. He let his gaze drift over the posters on the wall again, the slogans about fairness and integrity and commitment to the community. The words seemed to sneer at him. After a moment, the clerk returned, holding the forms between 2 gloved fingers like soiled laundry. She dropped them onto the counter without care. The stack of pages slipped and fell apart slightly, the top sheet sliding over the edge. When Solomon reached forward to gather them, the clerk lifted one hand dismissively and used the other to push them carelessly toward him. The motion was too hard. The papers slipped right off the slick countertop and scattered onto the stone floor. The pages spread in an untidy fan, each sheet a part of the plan he'd labored over for weeks, now face down on a floor tracked with the day's dust and footprints. He froze. For a long second, he didn't bend. His hip was screaming at him now, the nerve in his lower back sending sharp messages of warning. But there was no help. No one behind the counter moved. The clerk looked away deliberately, removing the gloves with slow, careful peels, dropping them in the trash without ever glancing at him again. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. He heard the shuffling of feet behind him as other customers shifted in discomfort, the unspoken tension thick as wet rope. But no one stepped forward. No one bent to help him. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Then he gripped the cane tighter, set it carefully at an angle to balance himself, and leaned forward. Pain lit his side as he bent, grabbing one sheet at a time with fingers that didn't work as well as they used to. He stacked them neatly. He felt the eyes on him, the pity, the embarrassment for him that no one wanted to feel too deeply. He didn't look at any of them. When he straightened again, breathing heavier than he wanted to admit, the forms were once again in order, though now marked with gray smudges from the floor. He adjusted the weight of his cane and inhaled slowly, pulling the air deep into his lungs to steady himself. The lobby had quieted to its typical hush, punctuated by the low hum of printers and the occasional polite, greeting offered to anyone who was not him. Solomon stood alone, the forms pressed tight to his chest, feeling every second stretch out like punishment. He glanced down the length of the polished floor toward the glass-walled advisory area at the back of the bank, a space where once upon a time he had sat in meetings about business loans and community development, where he'd been treated, if not as an equal, at least as someone worth the staff's practiced courtesy. He remembered those meetings in grainy detail now, the smooth handshake of a former manager, the respectful eye contact, the promise that his years of deposits and consistent payments actually meant something here. But that manager was gone, transferred or retired, replaced by Royce Calhoun and his practiced, brittle grin. Solomon felt the weight of the cane in his palm as he took a careful step forward. His hip still ached from bending to retrieve his fallen papers, a reminder in hot flashes of pain that dignity sometimes demanded more than pride. He kept his eyes ahead, determined, hoping the private meeting room might offer him something different, something human. But as he advanced, the atmosphere changed in a subtle, chilling way. The lobby staff watched him now, not with scorn, but with the cool alertness of a system calibrating to deny entry. One of the reception clerks, the one who had thrown his forms to the floor, walked briskly from behind the counter with a plastic sign in her manicured hands. She didn't look at Solomon directly as she crossed his path, but she timed it, so he had to stop short or collide with her. He paused, steadying himself on the cane as she passed, her heels clicking sharply on the hard floor. She reached the entrance to the advisory area, a glass double door held open with a magnetic latch, and set the sign squarely in the opening. She pressed down hard on the base to make sure it wouldn't budge, as though bracing against a storm. Solomon read it once, twice, blinking to make sure the words were real. Priority clients only, in bold navy letters, glossy and new. It wasn't handmade. It wasn't even improvised. It was printed by the bank itself, a policy they could deploy at will to shut doors in the face of whoever they wanted to exclude. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't need to. The sign spoke for her. Solomon felt a slow, heavy exhale escape him. His chest tightened. He had the forms ready. He had the plan prepared. He had done everything right. But they had decided he wasn't the right kind of client. He adjusted the line of his suit jacket, even though it felt futile now, and turned his eyes deliberately to the glass beyond the sign. Inside the advisory room, Royce Calhoun sat across from the young man in the tailored light gray suit, the one who had breezed in moments ago. They were laughing. Royce gestured to a tablet screen, pointing at numbers with feigned delight, his smile wide, his posture open and welcoming. The other man leaned back comfortably, completely unaware or uncaring of the man outside, leaning heavily on a cane, watching from beyond a clear wall of privilege. Solomon felt the moment stretch. He swallowed back something sharp that wanted to rise in his throat. He refused to let it show on his face. Instead, he turned away from a glass and forced his attention back to the sign, to the words that might as well have been a verdict. He shifted his weight, ready to move, to try the normal teller line again, if that's what it took. But as he turned, he felt the subtle movement behind him and paused. A shadow fell across the polished floor at his feet. Solomon didn't need to turn all the way to know who it was. The bank security guard, Clay Vaughn, had stepped closer. He was a big man with close-cropped hair, wide shoulders beneath the standard-issue navy blazer, and a heavy belt that sagged with keys and a flashlight and other small tools of polite intimidation. Clay stood just behind Solomon, arms folded across his chest, gaze focused not on the room, but on Solomon's back. Solomon felt the warmth of his presence in that cold lobby like a thread of heat about to burn. Clay didn't touch him. He didn't need to. The folded arms and the steady, fixed expression said enough. This was not for you. You don't belong here. Move along. Solomon clenched his jaw so hard the old molars ground painfully. He felt the way the carved cane bit into his palm, the symbols pressing deep, leaving shallow impressions in his skin. He forced his shoulders back, ignoring the pulsing pain in his hip, and lifted his chin by fractions of an inch. He would not let them see him stoop. He would not let them see him shuffle away like he had been cowed. But he did turn, slow and deliberate, feeling every fiber of the suit tighten with age and wear. He did step back, yielding the space, though they had never asked with words. Clay watched him retreat the few steps to the open lobby floor, arms never uncrossing. Solomon felt every gaze in the room on him. Rows of polished chairs sat empty along the walls, promising rest, but denied by unspoken rules. He had watched others sink into them freely, unchallenged, moments before he had approached the advisory area. But now, after being turned away, they felt like props in a cruel display, carefully arranged to remind him of everything he was not permitted to access. Solomon set his cane down deliberately with a tap that rang sharper than he intended. He felt the sound echo unkindly in the hushed room. He straightened his suit coat, which now held creases in all the wrong places from the way he had bent to collect his scattered paperwork. His hands trembled at the edges with age and restrained anger, the old compass ring biting into his skin. He shifted his weight and moved toward the reception counter once more. The clerks pretended they didn't see him, though their eyes flickered to him, and then away with mechanical efficiency. Solomon exhaled through his nose, a steady stream of air, and closed the distance, the cane tapping in slow warning. He reached the counter edge, resting the tip of his cane against the front for support. His shoulder sagged slightly with the motion, relief easing the strain in his hip for one fragile moment. But that moment was short-lived. One of the clerks, a different young woman this time, her hair drawn into a tight bun, paused whatever she was doing and turned her head with a sharp, performative precision. She watched where his cane touched the counter's edge. Without breaking eye contact, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a plastic spray bottle with the bank's logo on the side, the bright blue liquid inside sloshing with purpose. She shook it once, ensuring he could hear the liquid churn, then sprayed the spot where his cane had rested. The harsh chemical smell spread instantly in the air between them. She didn't hurry. She sprayed twice more, each pump deliberate. Then she set down the bottle with a clack and pulled a stack of disposable towels from the branded holder beside her. She wiped the surface in long, slow strokes, eyes still locked on him with an expression carefully trained to be neutral, even pleasant, the corporate customer service smile that felt like a slap. Solomon felt the eyes behind him. He didn't have to turn to know other customers were watching. Their attention caught by the harsh hiss of the spray, the squeak of the cloth against the counter. A few of them fidgeted, looking away quickly when they met his steady, steel-gray gaze. The clerk finished her ritual with professional flair, crumpling the now damp towels and dropping them into a waste bin under the counter with a small flourish, as if completing a task well done. Solomon forced his breath to remain even. His grip on the cane's handle tightened, so hard his knuckles went pale, the carved grooves biting deeper into his palm like a reminder of what dignity costs. He shifted his weight again, careful not to wince openly. The clerk had already turned away to resume her other duties, humming softly under her breath, ignoring him completely now that the surface was sanitized of his touch. He blinked once, long and slow. He felt the embarrassment settle in his belly like a stone. He felt the old fury too, but it churned low and cold, too heavy to flare. With effort, he turned away from the counter and scanned the lobby for somewhere to sit. His hip demanded it now. His balance was starting to falter from the hours of standing, and the tremor in his hand threatened to spill the forms he had spent so long straightening. He moved toward the nearest chair, a sleek, minimal thing with metal legs and an upholstered seat that promised a small measure of relief. He measured each step with his cane, the taps marking his slow progress like a sad drumbeat in the too-quiet room. As he approached, a young male staff member in business casual slacks and a bank-branded polo stepped briskly into his path. Solomon slowed but did not stop. He would not. The young man's expression stayed polite, even friendly, but his eyes flickered to the chair and then back to Solomon's face. Without a word, he reached down and tugged the chair back, just far enough that Solomon's reaching hand fell short. Solomon's fingers closed on empty air. Solomon Avery remained standing in the lobby's cold hush, the taste of bitter chemicals lingering in his throat from the way the clerk had so thoroughly sanitized any sign of him at the counter. He shifted once on his cane, feeling the heat of humiliation still burning through his ribs and settling in the pit of his stomach. Every muscle in his hip and lower back screamed at him to sit, to collapse even just for a moment, but he knew no chair would be offered, and the nearest seat had been claimed by silent denial. So he stood, he breathed, he counted the slow rhythm of his heart. He let the forms rest against his chest, his fingers pressed flat against them to hide their shaking. Around him, the lobby hummed back to its usual pace, people shuffling papers, the printer's warm buzz, the slide of credit cards across glass surfaces. All normal business that proceeded as if he weren't there, as if nothing humiliating had happened at all. He adjusted his stance, the cane biting into the tile with every movement. It was heavier than usual, its carved designs pressing hard against his palm, the smooth wood worn down by years of use. He had always admired the craftsmanship of it, the time someone had taken to make something so beautiful and functional, so personal to its owner. It was more than a tool, it was a piece of his story, something he refused to discard even when people sneered at its strange design or acted as if it marked him as old and fragile and out of place. The lobby doors opened again, sending in a breeze of dry September air, making the edges of the bank's glossy brochures flutter on their racks. Solomon braced against it without thinking, leaning harder on his cane. He felt the tremor of weakness shoot up his arm, shame sharpening the pain. He repositioned carefully, shifting the cane's angle to catch the weight, but he overcompensated. The base of the cane slipped forward an inch on the slick polished floor, the rubber tip squealing faintly before it lost grip entirely. Solomon felt his body tip. He exhaled in a sharp grunt, twisting reflexively to catch himself, but his bad hip screamed betrayal. The cane clattered to the floor with a dull, wooden knock, rolling away just out of reach. The sound cut through the lobby's hush like a gunshot. Several heads turned. He dropped his forms in his scramble, papers fanning out over the floor in familiar disgrace, but he didn't move for them yet. His eyes tracked the cane as it rolled and then rocked to a halt on its side. The carved cap at the top, the one that had been worn loose over the years, knocked free and fell off, bouncing once before spinning in a slow, mocking circle. From inside the hollow shaft of the cane, two tightly rolled tubes slid free and uncoiled themselves slightly on the bank floor. One was an old blueprint on yellowed paper, the edges frayed and brittle, the dark ink lines of a store layout intricate and precise. The other was a thick parchment stamped with faded but unmistakable red seals, official documents, notarized decades ago, but still clear enough to read his name in block letters, Solomon Avery, as the recorded owner of the property the store sat on and the land surrounding it. The seals bore the county's emblem, the notary's signature a looping flourish of bureaucratic authenticity. They were old, yes, but they were real and they were proof. Silence fell thicker than before. Conversations died. Even the printer seemed to stop its mechanical whirring for a moment. Solomon froze, one knee slightly bent, one palm on the floor for balance, the other braced on the glossy tile to keep from falling fully. He watched the papers for a second, breathing hard, the old blueprint crinkling under the bank's overhead lights. He could see his name in faded ink, see the surveyor stamps, the decades-old tax office approvals. He forced himself to move, to gather them with deliberate care. He collected the rolled documents first, ignoring the way his hip flared in agony. He felt sweat bead at his temples, wiped away with the back of his sleeve. Then he reached for the rest of his forms, the ones they had given him in the bank, the modern paperwork, smudged now from the floor, marked with indignity he would not forget. He moved carefully, every motion precise, refusing to let the old joints betray him more than they already had. As he collected the last paper, he caught sight of something under the row of chairs against the wall. It was the brass cylinder, old and tarnished, with a heavy lid that had popped free in the fall. He blinked once, hard, feeling the sting of memory. That seal had been given to him when he had founded the local community trust decades ago, back when banks had refused to loan to black business owners in his neighborhood. The trust had pooled their own money, giving small loans to each other, helping each family build something to pass down. He had chaired it even in his old age, refusing to let it die. He reached for the cylinder with slow care, pulling it back toward him. The cold lobby lights shone unforgiving on the worn creases of his suit and the beads of sweat drying on his lined forehead. His steel-gray eyes scanned the room, meeting each gaze that tried to dart away when caught. He had been bent and humiliated in front of them only moments ago, forced to scrape his life's work off the bank's gleaming floor while clerks smirked and guards loomed. But he was standing now, tall in the only way that mattered. His cane thumped once as he repositioned himself. The ache in his hip was a dull roar, every nerve firing in protest at the strain of standing so long without relief. But he would not sit. Not now. Not even if they suddenly offered a chair and a handshake and an apology. The older bank employee, the one who had gasped when she recognized the name on the brass seal, hesitated behind the counter. Her eyes flicked to Solomon's face and then quickly away to the watching customers, her expression tightening with unspoken knowledge. She had seen his name on those community documents years ago, probably in an old file she'd been forced to box up and send to the archive when the bank modernized and decided to forget who built half the neighborhood's credit history. Solomon shifted again, the roll of blueprints rustling softly as he moved. He glanced down at the papers now smudged from the floor, but still legible, each stamped with the official red seals of the city's permit office, some bearing faded signatures of city clerks, and even a former mayor or two. Every permit had been hard-won. Every signature had been an agreement, a promise made to a man who had pooled his neighbors' pennies to buy land when banks wouldn't lend them a dime. Decades ago, he had walked these very floors in a different suit with a different cane. These same papers rolled neatly in his hands, and a clerk then had stamped them without question, had shaken his hand, had congratulated him on building something for his community. Now he was treated like an unwelcome guest, unworthy of even the time it took to process his loan request. His eyes flicked to the glass office at the back of the lobby where Royce Calhoun still sat, hunched over his tablet screen, laughing with the young man in the pale suit. They hadn't even noticed the commotion outside. Or if they had dismissed it as irrelevant, unworthy of interrupting business for someone who could not possibly be worth the time. Solomon felt the blueprint shift in his grip. He adjusted it and felt the edge of the old parchment scratch against the inside of his wrist. He turned the roll slightly, catching the overhead light. The ink was faded but clear enough to see the careful lines of the store's layout, complete with dimensions and notes scrawled in his own handwriting, the letters precise despite the decades that had passed. He lifted the roll a little higher, not quite offering it, but displaying it for anyone willing to look. The clerk who had sprayed the counter glanced once, and then away immediately, her mouth pinched as though she tasted something sour. The older employee behind her swallowed hard, her eyes moving over the visible city stamps and the neat lines of signatures. She recognized them. She recognized him. Solomon lowered the blueprint slightly and let it rest again in his arm. He shifted the brass cylinder in his hand, the engraved letters catching the light. Avery Community Trust. He felt the weight of it, not just in his hand, but in the years it represented. The ring on his finger, dull silver with a compass design nearly worn smooth, glinted as he adjusted his grip on the cane. For the first time since he had walked into the lobby, he deliberately lifted his hand so the ring caught the full glare of the lights. The letters around the band were small, easy to overlook, but there if anyone bothered to see. Regional Trade and Credit Association, founding member 1965. It was the ring they had given only to the people who had set up the city's first integrated lending cooperative. The ring was old, the metal scratched and dulled, but it was real, and it was his. He had been given it after leading the first meeting in the basement of the Baptist church with nothing but folding chairs and coffee in donated tins, convincing neighbors who had been denied credit their whole lives to trust one another instead. He had worn it every day since. It was more than a ring. It was proof. He let the hand fall to his side again. The brass cylinder knocked gently against his thigh as he moved, the sound hollow but resonant, a memory of promises kept. Solomon exhaled once, loud enough that the clerk behind the counter blinked at him. He felt her eyes traveling from the seal to the blueprint to the land deed peeking out from the folds of his old folder, the red seals unmistakable even with decades of dust and wear. The air in Patriot National Bank shifted suddenly, like the quiet before a storm breaking. Solomon Avery stood near the reception counter, the worn papers in his arms marking him as more than just a customer, proof of a legacy no longer invisible. The calm hum of printers and the soft murmur of waiting clients dissolved as a sleek black sedan pulled up outside the polished glass entrance. The doors slid open with a quiet rush, and a sharply dressed man in his late 50s stepped out, briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding. This was no casual visitor. Inside, the bank staff had barely resumed their routines when the man entered, his polished shoes clicking firmly against the granite floor. Heads turned, whispers sparked. The man moved straight to the glass office where Royce Calhoun had retreated after laughing with his favorite client. The room fell silent as he lifted his voice, crisp and authoritative, calling the branch manager to the lobby. One by one, employees set aside phones and paperwork, trading uncertain glances. Solomon watched quietly, feeling the weight of history in the air. The man from the board of directors had a reputation for cutting through bureaucracy with surgical precision. His presence was a clear signal that this day would not end quietly. The assembled staff gathered in the lobby, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Royce Calhoun appeared, his confident demeanor slipping as the board representative's gaze swept over the group. With no preamble, the man addressed them all, his tone grave. He spoke of serious concerns raised at the highest level about the bank's recent handling of key clients and deposits, including the branch's treatment of one particularly long-standing customer. The words hung in the air, undeniable and accusatory. Solomon stood at the back, cane resting beside him, watching the ripple of shock and disbelief pass through the employees. Some exchanged nervous whispers, others avoided eye contact altogether. The board representative continued, making it clear that the bank's leadership had received complaints and evidence suggesting discriminatory practices and procedural failures. The fallout would be swift and sweeping. Employees were instructed to cooperate fully with upcoming audits, and the branch's operations were to be placed under immediate review. The implications were clear. The bank risked losing millions in deposits, and its reputation was on the line. As the meeting dispersed, the polished sign above the entrance, which had proudly proclaimed Patriot National Bank, was swiftly covered with a plain white sheet. Customers milling in the lobby were gently but firmly guided to the exits by bank personnel. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of confusion and quiet relief for those who sensed the severity of what was unfolding. Solomon moved slowly toward the exit, his cane tapping softly against the floor. Solomon Avery stood near the reception desk, his frame tall and dignified despite the hours of standing and the toll it had taken on his body. The brass seal cylinder lay beside his worn papers, wrapped carefully in red velvet cloth embroidered with the bank's corporate crest. The air was still, the quiet charged with the knowledge that change was imminent, irrevocable. At the center of this storm stood Royce Calhoun, the branch manager, once so confident, now visibly diminished. His navy suit hung a little looser, the crisp lines softened by stress and humiliation. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the thick stack of documents laid out before him on the polished counter, the termination papers demanding his signature. Around him, staff members gathered in small groups, whispering behind gloved hands, their faces a mixture of disbelief, relief, and wary anticipation. The board representative who had arrived days earlier was present again, overseeing the process with an expression of quiet resolve. No words were wasted. Royce's voice, once booming and assured, was now low and clipped. He signed his name with a shaky hand, the pen scratching sharply against the paper. The moment was both public and private, a ritual of accountability performed in front of witnesses. After signing, he removed his company badge from his lapel and placed it on the counter, along with his access card and a folded bank uniform shirt. The symbolic shedding of identity was palpable, a severing of the role he had abused. Solomon watched, steady and unmoving, feeling a quiet satisfaction not born of vengeance, but of justice finally being served. The staff's eyes shifted toward him occasionally, some with newfound respect, others with the awkwardness of shared complicity now confronted. The velvet-wrapped loan file was handed to a young, composed assistant with orders to deliver it personally to the regional director's office for immediate action. It was a gesture that carried the weight of redemption and restoration, a promise that Solomon's application, and by extension his legacy, would be treated with the seriousness it deserved. The assistant nodded solemnly and departed, the file cradled carefully as if it were a precious heirloom. Meanwhile, the rest of the bank staff lined up quietly along the walls of the lobby. Their posture was formal but subdued, each person silently acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Rumors of disciplinary transfers and policy reforms rippled through the group, signaling that no part of the branch's previous indifference or prejudice would be overlooked. Solomon's gaze drifted across the room, taking in the faces of those who had once ignored or dismissed him. Some averted their eyes, others met his briefly and then looked away. He understood. The road to change was never smooth, but this was a start. Slowly, he made his way toward the exit, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. The crowd parted respectfully, a silent acknowledgement of his resilience and the long-fought battle for dignity. As he reached the front doors, he paused and looked back once more. The bank, with all its gleaming surfaces and cold efficiencies, was no longer a place where he was invisible. His story, his struggle, had cracked the facade. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in warm gold and crimson. Solomon stepped into the fading light, feeling the weight of years and the promise of a future where respect would no longer be optional. His cane clicked steadily as he walked, each step a testament to perseverance, justice, and the enduring power of standing tall in the face of adversity. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives that uncover truth and justice. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Solomon's journey and the way the bank's story unfolded? Also, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can spark important conversations.